Hello and welcome to the Open Era podcast. My name is Simon Bushell, not joined by Devang Desai this week. Instead joined by Patreon extraordinaire, friend of the show and multiple-time guest now, Priyanka Dobson. Pri, thank you for being back on the show. What a week to bring you back on. Jesus, there's been a tremendous amount of tennis, tremendous amount of storylines to dig into.
Yeah, you would think with the amount of rain that has happened this week, we'd be talking about one or two matches. And no, there's so much that has happened, even with all the scheduling woes. So I think I watched something like 16 or 17 hours of tennis yesterday. So definitely tons to dig into.
Those are rookie numbers. We need to pump those up as the week goes on. We need to be hitting those 23, 24-hour numbers to be considered a true tennis nut at this point. Well, let's kick things off. I will defer to you as the guest today. Do you want to start with talking about Naomi Osaka versus Iga Swiatek or Rafael Nadal? The ball is in your court. Which one do you want to go first? Which one would you go with first?
Oh, I think maybe Nadal, because it was that first round, like such a big story, like that second day of the tournament or whatever. So if we're doing some sort of vague chronological order, that seems right to me. And then we can put a pin in it, I guess, until we talk a little bit more about who we eventually lost to and what's going on there. But yeah, it's a weird one as a Nadal fan to think about that what may have been his last match at the French Open has transpired. I'm in as deep denial as he is. It was actually his last. But I don't know. It was a really weird one. I think we've been a little bit spoiled the last couple years with, the greats and how they retire and how they go out of the game. And I would really take a 6-love bagel to Hubie Hurkacz in a quarterfinal right now over what we got with Nadal losing in the very first round with like the nightmare of a draw pick of the number 4 seed. He who must not be named is what I always call him.
Well, expectations were about as low as you can possibly get going into this tournament. The fact that he even played it to start with, I think, was surprising to many, just given his form and given the noises that came out of the camp in the run-up to Roland Garros. Well, I guess let's start with the manner of the performance. This is obviously, like as a Nadal superfan on your side of things, and I think just broadly for tennis as well, this is an incredibly disappointing result just from a story perspective and just wanting to see a great player go out. But in some ways, would he want this to lose in the first round on a court that he made so famous? This is just his 4th loss ever at Roland Garros. Does the fact that he came back and gave it a go, is that testament to his fighting spirit? Or do you think that he may leave somewhat disappointed by this result and maybe wanted something different from a narrative perspective?
It's hard because Rafa himself is always like, I don't think about narratives. I don't think about legends. I don't think about records. Well, all of your fans do. So on behalf of them, I was really bummed that he had to go out, his crazy record of never having lost back-to-back clay matches, like had to be broken in this fashion, in this regard, in his last match in Roland Garros against this guy. So I would have preferred that he had kind of left it in 2022. I remember watching his victory speech at the 2022 championship and holding my breath, being like, he's going to retire. He's going to pull a Sampras or a Barty, and he's going to do it. He's going to do it on the court. And he didn't. And now I kind of wish that he had, because it would have been such a badass move. But obviously he had a good Wimbledon after that. He still had more juice in him. And I think for me, the lack of closure, I feel, I can't speak for him, is that he was playing well enough to have beaten a lot of other people. The season he's having so far, he is taken to 3 sets by Pedro Cachin and then asked for his t-shirt afterward. But the way he was, and he always said he wouldn't even start playing the tournament if he didn't think he could be competitive. And so when he started, I was like, I guess he thinks he has a shot. And he was playing like he had a shot, a little bit of nerves in the beginning, but he was actually following the scoreline of Federer's last match pretty closely, losing 6-3 in the first, taking it to a tiebreak and losing in the second. But he could have beaten a lot of other players in the draw that day. So I think that's what was tough for me, is just the magnitude of the draw, the magnitude of the randomness of the draw, giving him an opponent that one of the very few opponents he probably, maybe not very few, maybe that's my Nadal fandom overstating it, but one of the opponents that he could not have beaten. He had to have been at his very best and his full and fittest and healthiest. But he could have done what I'm now calling the Federer, is like going out in the quarterfinals, or he probably also could have done a Serena, of, beating the number two or having a really good second round win and then going out gracefully in the third round to a very mild mannered Ayla Tomljanovic. But all to say, clearly he thought he could, and I think he could, and he played like he could. And unfortunately, he just ran into one of the best playing right now.
I completely agree with you. I think there was enough there in that loss and his performance to suggest that there is still a little bit of gas left in the tank. I think the question is really whether or not that is enough for someone who has ascended to the heights of the sport the way that he has. And ultimately, what kind of retirement I think he wants to have. Like, what legacy does he want to leave? And not necessarily legacy. What is the memories that he wants to leave on this farewell tour? Because there's so much to be said for legends of sport and how they choose to bow out and what sort of trajectory that takes on. With the Nadal one, it's just been, retirement after retirement or pull out of tournaments. This sort of drip feed of, is he coming back? Is he not? There hasn't been a clear sort of end point of saying that he's done, even though I guess we've kind of had that with the 2024 announcement, but even then him making noises about maybe want to playing the French Open again. So this one's just, maybe it's been a little messy and maybe hasn't had the ribbon tied on it that a lot of people wanted it to have.
Yeah, and he's a part of that too, right? Apparently he told Mauresmo he didn't want a big crazy ceremony for his first loss, right? And he would rather come back at a later time and do something separate and not overshadow everything. So I think he's even kind of keeping the door open. I just think the guy doesn't know what to do if he's not playing tennis. Like, apologies to his family and his adorable son, but I think he doesn't want to say no. And so he doesn't want to put a pin in it. But, he allowed Madrid and Rome to like kind of do their retirement ceremonies and their big send-off. So I guess he's getting there, but I wonder if wrapping his own head around it is also what's taking this long, let alone what his body is doing.
It should not be understated. 4 losses in his career. The magnitude of this, I know with all the circumstances and everything, but to just have that 4th loss it's really genuinely remarkable. It's one of the most incredible records in all of sport. And I don't think we should discount it just because of the circumstances. Still, to beat him on that court regardless is an achievement.
And that's the thing. No one's going to remember this as the only part of his legacy, right? Let alone his French Open legacy, let alone his legacy as an entire tennis player. Like, very few of us are remembered by our very last moments and are the last thing that we do. So he still has everything else to rest on. And you could hear it in the crowd. You could see it, Iga, Carlos, Novak, like all came to see him play. Like, everyone is going to remember everything that he did. He has the statue there. I think it's going to be fine in that regard. We're just all a little greedy. We all want a little bit more, even though we've gotten so much more than we ever thought we would.
When's the Netflix documentary coming out for Rafael Nadal? That's what we can hope for. We're looking forward to that side of things.
Only if it's a different production team than Breakpoint. maybe they do it with another partner. But yeah, I'd watch that to hear what his mindset was going into that whole thing and how he felt it went.
Is there a joke in there to be made about how they would paint Alexander Zverev as the good guy in this whole thing?
Yeah, honestly, they'd probably be like, he was so deferential and so nice and like made it a good show. What a nice fellow.
Goodness me. Anyway, we can come on to that in parting shot. It's not been a good week for that guy in that regard. Let's move on with the greatest respect for Rafa Nadal. It's been a pretty astonishing week or so, just given the amount of storylines that unfolded. I think we saw one of the best women's matches of the modern era. I think that's maybe not in terms of consistent high level of tennis, but certainly in terms of narrative, drama, and storylines. I'm, of course, talking about Iga Swiatek versus Naomi Osaka, former world number one versus current world number one, both 4-time Slam champions. Everything we could possibly want in the early stages of a tournament, Osaka coming back, and it produced just dynamite tennis. It produced one of the best matches I think I've seen in many a year, just from the perspective of not knowing what was going to happen, the twists and turns in it. I loved every minute of this. How about you?
Same. I watched it throughout my workday, so don't tell my employer, but just on my phone, on the side, on the subway, listening to it on the radio when it was clear that maybe the third set was going in a different direction than we all thought at 5-2 up. I like ran to the corner of my office and put my phone in front of my laptop so no one could see, like a true delinquent. But all to say, that was such a amazing match and such a mesmerizing match. I genuinely couldn't take my eyes away. And I didn't realize how much I missed Naomi Osaka like playing like this on the tennis court until I saw her up against Swiatek. And I just lights out. Like, why wasn't that a final? That could have been a final, and as early as the second round. Like, who knew?
There's many ways that we could tackle this. I think testament to Swiatek's fighting spirit to come back the way that she did and defend that court. It's interesting that we go from Rafael Nadal to talk about Iga Swiatek in terms of defending that court and defending the record that she has there, attempting to go for the three-peat. But I would say on this, it does give an illustration and it does give a reminder perhaps to the tour. Naomi Osaka is really, really damn good. You don't be a 4-time slam champion and world number one and be playing on your weakest surface. She scared the absolute daylights out of Iga Swiatek. I don't think this was Iga playing badly at all. I think this was just the level that Osaka got to for a little while. And when she's playing like that, look out. This is a sign perhaps that this could be a player that's coming back to form fully and should be reckoned with the rest of the season, if possibly.
And I wonder if some of it had to do with just the low expectations everybody had. Naomi's never been, she's obviously has a tempestuous relationship with the French Open in the past, and clay has never been her favorite surface. So despite, her reputation, folks were like, oh, it's Iga at clay, Iga at the French Open rather, it's going to be 6-1, 6-2, claps for Naomi for showing up. But the level that she showed was just, I don't know if it was the dreaded Danielle Collins, is she playing freely because she has nothing to play for question, or because the expectations are so low question. But I also think, just their lack of match play between each other for the last 2 years. I feel like Swiatek is a good student of the game. She always gets troubled by big hitters, but she is, studied a Rybakina, played a Rybakina, played a Sabalenka a lot. She hasn't played Osaka as much, right? So you could kind of argue maybe some of it was the element of surprise of being able to play Osaka at the level that she's capable of. And Swiatek kind of being thrown off course and as the princess of clay or whatever we're calling her until she gets to her own 14 titles, she had that same inevitability that Rafa used to have of like, is she really going to lose this? And this was the first time that I was like, she might actually lose this in the second round.
Make no bones about it. She was very, very close to losing here. Given being down a double break or the position she found herself in the third set, it was quite the comeback. She looked so focused and calculated getting over the line. There was an inevitability once she caught up and got to 5-all in that I thought, oh God, it's coming. The wave is coming. And it turned out to be the case. Momentum's a funny thing in sport, and I think it's doubly so when you're a player of a quality who can harness that energy. And I think it was on full display here. Like, Osaka basically got overwhelmed just from in a way that many players have. It was sort of a tidal wave for the last 20 minutes, and it completely turned the direction of that match.
Yeah, and I feel like that is uncharacteristic of her, or maybe just a symptom of the break, because it almost followed, some of the 5-set matches on the men's side, where in the fifth set, these qualifiers or these lesser ranked players had the momentum, they had the break, it looked like they were going to do it, and they just got in their own head once it became a reality. And I feel like Osaka has to remember, just get that routine or that muscle memory under her belt of like, she's also a champion. And like, yeah, it's real that she could beat Iga Swiatek on Philippe Chatrier at Roland Garros. And like, she's capable of it and she can do it. And I hate to pretend I can see the inside of an athlete's head because I can't, but like, she seemed hungry. She seems to want it. She's tweeting pictures of Squidward and SpongeBob being like, I'm sad I'm not still playing, and I'm sad I'm not there. And I'm excited to see that version of Osaka back who like wants it and is excited and knows she can do it.
Never underestimate the power of a good break to clear the mind and come back and focus on all those side of things. Let's just quickly touch on the WTA, on the women's draw, because there's been a few, I would say, surprising results, but at the same time, you have the top 4 women's seeds through to the second week for the first time since 2013. That is, of course, that's assuming wild. That some business gets taken care of today. We bookmark this on Sunday. Were you as surprised by that statistic as I was? Because I know the French Open has thrown some randomness over the years, but you would have thought that's a long time. We're talking nearly a decade that the top 4 players have made it to the latter stages of this tournament.
It's absolutely wild to think that it's been over 10 years that this has happened. I mean, we talk about, I think in the Discord a lot, the variance of 2-set tennis or best of 3-set tennis rather, and what that can do to upsets and why it makes upsets so much more common in the women's game just by virtue of like every point matters a little bit more. But I was still pretty shocked by this. I think in my draw, I had doubts about Rybakina. I just don't really know how she was doing on the way in. She had all these allergies. Swiatek, of course, I have her going all the way to win. And Sabalenka, she's been playing great, but also Grand Slams. I mean, she's kind of dispelled that as well. But all to say, genuinely shocked, even with all the talk of how chalky the WTA is starting to seem. And it's almost like the tours we're supposed to be different kind of going in, or we're supposed to mirror each other going in. The WTA being chalky and the ATP being wide open. Spoiler, the ATP is not as wide open as we all said it was. But actually, yeah, this is really surprising.
Let's take a look and a check in on the Canadians. I noticed that you put this into the notes, and shout out for as someone who is a proud Canadian, despite my accent. I feel like I should be more inclusive sometimes of the Canadian content on this show. That being said, there seems to be an ongoing theme with all four players who showed signs of life only to be annihilated at the back end of their particular matches. So I guess positive signs overall for Auger-Aliassime, Shapovalov, Leon Fernandez, and Bianca Andreescu, whilst at the same time recognizing that there's clearly levels still that they have to reach.
I put this in there too because I feel like all of these players are of a similar generation, and just watching that generation get kind of squeezed out. It's less common on the WTA. Obviously, Bianca has a slam. Layla got to a final, which is further than Felix or Shapo have gotten, if I'm remembering correctly. But to watch these players, like, they had their peak, they looked like they were on the rise to get where they needed to get those major results, and then all kind of had setbacks of different types, injuries or just running out of gas. I mean, I don't think I realized how late in the game, like, Milos Raonic was still doing things and like is still doing things. So I just find it really interesting, kind of like the squeezing out of this particular year, like age gap of tennis players, and the Canadians being like one of the prime examples of, like, from one nation having success all of this like same age and kind of same time, and how it's not really played out for them, unfortunately, in the way that it could have.
Out of the four players mentioned, did you have a particular player that perhaps stood out of that bunch for their week, their results perhaps, and maybe positive signs looking forward? I think I would just suggest, I think the Felix Auger-Aliassime week is actually quite positive, despite being a seeded player and all those sort of things. Perhaps the manner that he lost to Carlos Alcaraz, he did not, especially that final set, there was a letting go of the ropeness in a way that I think was sort of disappointing to see, a lack of fight. Of course, that could be tied to physical shape or anything, but I think positive signs there overall, but at the same time recognizing that still you want to see a little bit more dig, a little bit more competitiveness in a fourth round, especially against the third seed here.
For sure. I thought Felix looked solid. I don't know if something was going on with Ben Shelton or if Felix was just having a good day. Of course, Felix had a tougher morning today, and maybe has been hit with a little injury. But I was actually really impressed by Bianca Andreescu. I kind of had her going out in the first round in 18 hours against Sarah Stormo. But to beat the 23 seed, the new Colin Skinner, part of the new power couple in tennis, I guess. And even taking Paolini to 3 sets in the pouring rain, which was also wild considering all the weather that wasn't called. But all to say, I think she had a really solid tournament.
Let's talk about Andrei Rublev. Let's talk about perhaps what is becoming a worrying trend. Yeah. I think I wrote in the Discord server that this is actually turning into something that's quite problematic to watch on court. And I feel like long-term listeners of the show know I'm not a think of the children level of person in regards to this on the tennis court. That being said, there is a pattern of behavior here which is kind of disturbing to watch, and it suggests that it's not moving in a positive direction, put it that way. It's not like it's shown signs of improvements here. And I think his tennis is moving in relation to that as well.
It's hard because he has looked physically quite good in stretches this year. Like, I watched the Madrid final, speaking of Felix, and Rublev had like a tonsillar abscess or just looked absolutely miserable. And it looked like Felix was going to get his first Masters title with 3 walkovers or whatever it was, and maybe a retirement. And Rublev like dug himself out of that one with like a kind of mental fortitude that I think we all thought he didn't have, let alone now he seems to have regressed all the way back in the other direction. And I think he said in his presser that it was the worst he's ever behaved at a Grand Slam. But I'm like, this goes beyond behavior. You know, this wasn't like a tantrum. It seems deeper than that. And to be the only top 10, I think the top 13 ATP seeds made it to the second week. He was the only one that didn't. And it's clearly something else is going on. You know, I know after Madrid, he said, you know, he's been meditating, he's been doing all these things, but I don't know if he needs like a coaching change or something. Like maybe it just goes beyond psychology. But yeah, it's definitely a worrying trend, especially considering how good his like actual tennis can look when everything is working.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's so fascinating, isn't it, to have a tournament with the level of randomness that we've seen, but it's really kind of been chalk in a lot of ways, especially from the top end of the tour. Like it's been fairly smooth sailing. We'll come on to some Novak Djokovic talk in a second. I just want to quickly touch on Olga Danilovic. She has a horseshoe somewhere, it has to be said, given her escapability in back-to-back matches. We're talking about Houdini levels of escape that's happened. First against Danielle Collins, somehow figuring out how to get out of that match, given where she found herself. And then against Donna Vekic again, after being blown out and bageled in the first set. You will not find a situation, if you are a chronic gambler, of a parlay of two less unlikely or more unlikely things to happen than her getting through both of those matches. And perhaps, again, you know, a testament to tennis, it's never over. You always have to win that final point. But Jesus Christ, she was so close to losing on multiple occasions and was dead to rights. To come through that is such an achievement, and I wanted to call it out here.
I love that. I mean, she beat my now beloved Danielle Collins, someone who I've decided to be a fan of in her last year of professional tennis. So late to the party there. But this is why we love the game, right? Is that anyone can make a run. Unfortunately, she got stopped by Vondrousova, but it's just, you know, it's just always nice to see. We focus so much on the top players for whom like a second round or a third round win is so routine, or like a Rublev, a third round loss is so upsetting that, you know, you behave the way that he behaved. But it's so refreshing to see the people who cry after a second round match that they win, right? Who it means so much to them, not just money, not just clout, just the belief that they can do it. Like it's the little stuff like that keeps me coming back to tennis.
Lots of tears this week, wasn't there? Thinking about it, decent amount of tears on court.
Yeah.
It was an emotional week. Perhaps Andre Rublev should learn from this. A good cry solves a lot of things.
Yeah, maybe that would make him feel better. It's just a good cry.
Okay, let's leave it there. We'll come back after the break. There's plenty more things to get into, a few more matches to dig into, and some other headline stories that have happened. We'll touch all on it in parting shots. We'll see you after the break. Welcome back to the Open Era podcast. It's time for parting shots. So you have been to the US Open,
Yes.
and I'm going to say that you are someone who has enjoyed a beverage or two while attending a sporting event in your life. Just making an assumption here.
That would be a correct assumption.
What has been yeah. Don't want to infer too much here, but you never know. Let's examine from your perspective, has this French crowd have they stepped over the line? Because there has been a few occasions this week which would certainly indicate that the answer is yes.
Yeah, it's hard for me to conflate if this is just if this is a symptom of everyone's general forgetting of how to be outside that has seemed to happen since we've all had to go back outside after the pandemic. Like you're seeing it at concerts, you're seeing it just in crowds in general, like people are throwing things. So part of me is like, is this just how humanity behaves outside these days when in a crowd, since we, lost like a good 2 or 3 years of remembering how to do it. But David Goffin getting spat at was a pretty low point. And for me, the Jarry and Corentin Moutet match. I think that one, like Nicolas Jarry just looks like the nicest guy in your office. And the way that he was being treated on that court was as if he was like the second coming of the devil, just by virtue of the fact that he had drawn a French player in the first round. Like, makes me think there's definitely something different this year than there has been in past years.
I think there's a ton to be said about how people are having to learn how to react to be back in public spaces. And I definitely take that point on board. I think there's definitely something to be said of the relationship of alcohol in sporting events as well. And that's, you don't want to, it's such a tricky one, right? Because I was talking to my partner about this and saying that, so in tennis or in sports where you're largely required to be quiet the majority of the time, that all kind of works, and the social contract kind of works up to the point where like 5% of the population or 5% of the court doesn't abide by that. And I think what we have seen is that there is always going to be a 5%, regardless of the event that you're at, who are going to be assholes. And I think it kind of it shows up more prominently in tennis, simply just because the rules indicate that you do have to have this period of quiet. Like, you have to have a sustained period where you're not calling out during rallies, you're supporting in a very particular way. And there is this kind of like social etiquette level of going to tennis in a way that doesn't exist in other sports, where you can yell out all the time in a team sport event. There is not periods where you have to be very, very quiet. And maybe that just takes a little bit of learning for people who've never been there before. You know, I'm trying to throw the massive benefit of the doubt to them here, but it is an interesting sport in terms of how you're supporting and how you can choose to demonstrate your support on court.
Yeah, it definitely requires a little bit of learning. I've taken many a newbie to the U.S. Open or a tennis tournament and had to kind of talk them through not only the ins and outs of the scoring system, but exactly what you're talking about, the things that are not said out loud. You know, you don't clap for a double fault, like that's not really kosher, you know, all those types of rules. But I don't know. Also, having gone to the U.S. Open so much, I'm lucky enough to, you know, live in the greater area, so it's not as it's easier for me to do than for most folks. But alcohol has always been allowed in the stands there, right? They make the honey deuce is maybe the signature sports cocktail in the world, I would say. And even then, the American crowds have not, quote unquote, descended to this level. Let's see this year. They've certainly had their fair share of rowdiness, as has the AO crowd, but something about this crowd feels a little bit more menacing. I don't know if it, not to get too deep here, but if it just ties to just the general, like, we're also online now that no one seems like real people anymore. So when you yell things out at a player, spit at a player, it doesn't seem like you're doing something to a real human person, you know? But all to say, you know, when I went to the French Open a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough again to see Rafa there, which was amazing. They didn't allow alcohol at Chatrier for any of the quarterfinals. And yet, you know, you still heard that same like French trill chant that that we all hear in the background of the commentary the entire time, and people got plenty rowdy. So part of me is like, is booze a scapegoat for what's actually going on, and is it actually going to help anything? It seems to have a little bit, but maybe also there are just like less matches and less things going on. So I don't know.
No, it's a very fair point. I would agree with you. I'd say the answer is yes. I think it is a scapegoat for wider poor behavior. I think the alcohol probably just exacerbates that. It elevates it in some ways and makes it more prominent. But, you know, the alcohol doesn't change. It changes some things, certainly, but it's not enough, I think, to sort of cure the underlying levels of, if you are going to spit on a person, I think it doesn't matter if you're wasted or sober. I think your just reasoning or rationale may like drop down a few seconds, but I think you're still going to do that. We've talked on the show before about like what is considered a good crowd and how what makes a good atmosphere in a tennis match. And I do it's such a thin line to walk, because you do want to have a little bit of, you know, but not a bit of spice. Spice makes it sound like it's too aggressive. You want to have a level of encouragement without it turning into being aggressive.
Yeah.
And that's just, maybe that is a hard combination. It's just a hard cocktail to bring around whenever you're trying to get 20,000 disparate people in a space. Maybe that's just a very difficult thing to happen. And what we're asking for is maybe too difficult to achieve.
I don't think it's and I want to tread lightly here. I don't think it's a coincidence that it becomes a little bit rowdier on these outer courts. And this is not about like access or money or wealth. I think it's about investment. And again, not investment in a monetary sense, but to me, the best crowds in tennis are crowds that are invested in a good match. They're invested in one, ideally both of the players. They're invested in like collectively coming together and making it a good environment. And I say this because I've seen this, and I've even been this person, not to a spitting level, but in the early weeks of a tournament, when you've been watching tennis all day and you're wandering from match to match, and you end up on some outer court with players you may not be as emotionally tied to, or not care as much about the outcome of their match, you're a little less invested, and so you're a little less likely to quote follow the unsaid rules or actually pay attention in the right way. So I think that might have something to do with it. Like, I think we're going to see less and less of it as it goes forward. But last night I was watching Kokkinakis and Fritz, and people were just screaming for it to get to a fifth set, even though everyone looked so tired and it was like midnight already. And Fritz was clearly like, I should have closed this out in 3. But the people were just screaming Thanasi Kokkinakis' entire name and like a tons of chants because they were just invested in more tennis. And it felt a little bit better than what had been happening. So for me, that's like the key. And I just don't know how you build that. I don't know how the best way to design investment is, or to spur investment from a crowd into players. I'm really not sure.
I've never asked this question on the podcast, and perhaps it's one that we can park, and I'll leave it open for a food for thought question. What does tennis look like without silence in between points? What happens if you have a situation where you can just have a team sport, you can shout out at any point, and you have chanting throughout a match? It probably takes on a completely different complexion. I'm not sure that's great for the athletes in any capacity. It seems like a disaster waiting to happen.
Right. And it's tennis being such an individual sport. I think about NFL football, that it's like generally loud throughout the entire match, but American football, but there is a little bit of quiet when the quarterback is, about to throw, do what he needs to do in the beginning of the play, just like a hair. So I can maybe see a little bit of that, of like everyone quiets down for the serve. And then the rest of it, there's some chatter. But again, I think it would take a long time. It would take a lot of the old faithful who like it to be super quiet to go away, I think, for that to entirely change.
Well, what better way than to alienate the entire old faithful than to change some of the scheduling rules? Perfect transition and segue here. Who doesn't want to watch Novak Djokovic against Lorenzo Musetti at 3:15 in the morning?
Oh my God.
So this is farcical, like complete farcical. I'll say this up front. Like, it's truly ridiculous to have these two players playing at 3 in the morning. All that being said, is there any other sport in the world that this happens in? I can't think of any other sport where this could end up being maybe you could get a situation where you have like playoff hockey in multiple overtimes ending up this late and time difference and all that sort of stuff. But there is no world in which this can be considered a good thing, surely.
No, and the only example recently, I know the Las Vegas Grand Prix took place at like 11 p.m. Pacific time and like 2 a.m. Eastern time, but still the athletes weren't playing at 2 a.m., weren't driving at 2 a.m. Eastern time. Not that 11 p.m. is much better, but it was not 3 a.m. for me. And I was so tired watching them play. It was like nearly not enjoyable at some point, because I just wanted them to be able to lie down and like get in an ice bath or something. I don't understand how it's like legal is the wrong word, but the level was also so high that part of the reason the match was so long, right, is because they were hitting these like 20 plus shot rallies 2-3 in the morning. But that's just going to mess up Djokovic's entire tournament. It would have messed up Musetti's entire tournament. Like, whoever wins, I think Medvedev said after his like 4 a.m. Australian Open finish that affected him like until the final. And I feel like when you're getting to that point, at some point something has to be done, right?
It throws in huge questions of equality when it comes to, and fairness as well, of which players are being selected to go into those late matches. How is it balanced out? All that kind of stuff. Who's getting that court time? Because if you're being sent to play at 11 o'clock, yeah, sure, it can be the world number one and there's a hope that that's wrapped up in 2 hours. But at the same time, that's no guarantee at all. You can't be scheduling things around that or like trying to make assessments here, because this is so damaging. What time do you think Novak Djokovic got to bed? 7 a.m.? probably something around that with press and all the other things that had to come with it. Like
at best.
And trying to get rid of all the adrenaline that comes with these as well. Like he's barely probably going to get any sleep at the back end of this.
Yeah, Casper Ruud was apparently answering tweets at like 3 a.m, like about the match. And everyone was like, "Bro, why are you awake?" And he was like, "The adrenaline. Like I have at least 2 hours. It's the adrenaline and like the post-match routine. You're going to be awake for at least 2 hours after any match is over." So, and even I would love to understand how it affects their daytime routine. Does Novak wake up at 9 a.m. and be like, "Cool, let me try to sleep till noon because there's no way I'm getting on court before 9 p.m. at the earliest." I can't imagine what it's like to sit around and wait and how that affects your prep and all of that. Like it's just got to be so disruptive on so many levels, let alone to the fans who like can't even get home in the Paris Metro after it's over.
I remember Dele Alli talking about this, the English football player, about how obviously got long and sad story about being addicted to sleeping pills, and him sort of having an interview saying that a decent amount of the Premier League and the wider footballing scene is addicted or like is actively taking sleeping pills because your body is so wired at the back end of these events that you just desperately, your body is exhausted, your mind's exhausted, and you just really want to sleep desperately more than anything else. But you're just not able to because you're so physically wired from being put in a sort of gladiatorial arena and having to compete at elite level in sport. It's one of those things that is so hidden in some ways and yet makes all the sense in the world if you consider to be, if you put yourself sort of empathetically in the position of, imagine your most heightened emotional state that you've been in, and then do that for like 7 matches and have that happen at 3 o'clock in the morning, and then you try and sleep. It's obviously ridiculous, the idea that you ever would be able to fall asleep that easily. And I think perhaps that is not spoken about enough when we talk about all the scheduling side of things.
And then my question to you, or kind of to the general tennis community, like, is there any way, we already see this on the women's side, Elena Rybakina has been really loud about the WTA scheduling woes, but is there any way to fix this when best of 5 set tennis on the men's side exists and the capacity for a match to go for 4.5 hours exists? I think someone put together that all 4 of the women's matches that took place today on Sunday put together are basically the same amount of time that Djokovic and Musetti played last night, which is insane to think about. But, by having best of 5 set tennis, you are guaranteeing a minimum of some degree. So, is there any way to make this any better without amending 5 set tennis?
I don't think so. I really don't, unless they're going to extend the tournament for longer periods of time, let people play earlier, all that kind of stuff. I don't think so. I think that's something's going to give at some point, isn't it? And this has come up too many times. And it will be really, really fascinating to see if this is taken on by the PTPA or there's enough appetite by it as a labor movement of whether or not they want to sort this thing out. Because, yeah, you can definitely see a situation where as a body, they say, look, I've had enough. Like, I can't be finishing matches at 3 a.m. anymore. I can't be getting, even less than that, I can't be finishing matches at midnight and going to sleep at 4 a.m. and trying to be competitive in tournaments. That just can't be happening anymore. We've got to push back against that. So I can definitely see an avenue where this is taken on by the player body.
Yeah, I mean, Djokovic tried to use all kind of his sway yesterday to get them to sweep the court. I think he got a time violation in like the 4th set. And Mary Carrillo was like, playing at this hour is a time violation, which I thought was very clever. But, with a lot of these major night matches in the main stadiums being played by these top players, hopefully there's some sway. Djokovic does have a record of going to greater powers that be. He did it at the Tokyo Olympics to try to improve things for players. So maybe, let's see. But Mauresmo does not seem to be, at least in this specific one instance, Mauresmo as a tournament director does not seem to be so flexible. But in a long sense, hopefully there's some advocacy from someone, because it was like almost painful to watch at some point, despite the great tennis level all around.
Oh, Lord, you said something there. I did not put it in the notes. It's yet again a very poor year for scheduling, and specifically women's tennis, and specifically the comments around women's tennis as well. Good Lord, it's been awful in that regard.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the stat I just cited around the hours of the women's game versus the Musetti-Djokovic game was like meant to be an insult, being like women's tennis is so lame and short and not worth watching. So,
yeah. There is no easy transition here to say, just say trigger warning on some discussions of DB here. The Alexander Zverev trial literally continues while he's playing. Like, this is
It's
The
happening.
level of absurdity. You cannot write this stuff. It's so ridiculous. Maybe it's worth assessing and talking about more at the conclusion of the trial. Other than I just wanted to bring it up here to say some quotes came out about the alleged actions of Alexander Zverev to his partner during the course of the week, during the course of this trial. It's harrowing, it's bleak, and it certainly follows a pattern of behavior which we'd previously seen as elevated as discussed in the Olga Sharapova case. This is awful. This is just
Yes.
on many levels. It's obviously awful for the both poor young ladies involved, and also just in general as a look of someone who has a powerful station, someone who holds authority in a sport and is deploying money to try and silence people as well. And then, of course, like the wider question of how this looks on the sport, just terrible. Just terrible. I don't really have anything else to say. It's just awful all around.
Yeah, and this was what I was kind of dancing around when we were talking about, Nadal earlier, is a big stain for me on this entire thing on Nadal's last match was that he was facing Alexander Zverev, and that Zverev was going to be a part of history in this way, in a way that I don't think he deserves any more attention than the massive amounts of attention and press and, social media exposure he already gets officially from the ATP, which is really quite dispiriting already. But after reading some of the details, the intimate details of the trial, which are quite upsetting, it was even more upsetting that no one seems to say anything. It almost feels dystopian in a way that folks are just ignoring what's going on, as if there's no journalistic integrity, or as if there's no even reason to bring it up, as if that's not like a fundamental part of his character. It's very dispiriting. It's very dystopian. It's terrible, to your point. And it's what are they going to do if he wins the tournament? He could totally win the tournament. If no one brings it up and he goes all the way to win or even to the final, it's going to be tough for me as a tennis fan, as a female tennis fan, not to be a father of daughters guy, but like not just as a female tennis fan, but just as a human person, that we are just willing to look away from these types of things in the name of athletic achievement. It's really dispiriting.
It really is. No, it absolutely is. Let's touch on a retirement and a potential retirement, or almost. We'll see. We'll see how things play out. Let's say Alizé Cornet definitely retired, playing last match in the first round at Roland Garros. She has such an interesting career record in terms of some of her highs and some of her lows as well. His highest was world number 11. She, I think, still holds the longest straight. She holds that record of 69 straight Grand Slam appearances, which is a ridiculous record. She beat Iga Swiatek to snap that 37-game winning streak at Wimbledon last year. Someone who is just a stalwart of the tour, like someone who is by all accounts, just a tough out in any tournament, a great player, never ascended to the true upper echelons of the game, but someone who I think is going to be really missed.
Yeah, I mean, her reputation of the giant killer always made her fun to watch in a tournament, to see what she was going to do or who she was going to take down. I think she had some wins against Serena as well that were that knocked the draw wide open type of thing. And so she'll definitely be missed. I think that type of consistency is super underrated. I mean, we'll get to challengers and the Challenger Tour and how difficult it is to even make the main draw of a slam, let alone make it, 69 times in a row. So kudos to her. And I think she should always be remembered for also speaking out around Peng Shuai. And it's possible the WTA didn't take the stand they did without her kind of speaking out. So wanted to make sure that was cited also as part of her legacy.
And then secondarily, we mentioned Rafael Nadal potentially playing his last French Open. I think Andy Murray is as well. Certainly sounds like noises out of the camp. This might be his last French Open in addition. But I guess we've said that about 6 times about him at this point, so you never quite know. But it surely sounds like this is it from the perspective of not playing this tournament again.
It sounds like it. And I was so talking about narrative, like having him and Wawrinka play against each other, like these two men that fought against the gods, right? And each managed to still get 3 slams out of it anyway. was actually, I don't know if it was emotional for me. I was already feeling emotional about Nadal and was just sitting in my feelings, but it really does feel like this era of tennis that we all expected to be over maybe 5-7 years ago is now actually ending. So I think it might be the end for him, which is a bummer. But he hasn't seemed to been able, and Dominic Thiem as well. I think this should be said if we're talking about endings of people who have had good Roland Garroses, not to take the spotlight all away from Andy, because to your point, I do think it is the end for him. But even seeing him going out in the qualifiers after not getting a wild card and all that drama, it's just really got a sense of like bittersweet nostalgia over this tournament for me.
Absolutely. Let's take one final quick break. When we come back, we'll do a quick roundup of challenges. Can't have you on the show and not have a quick discussion about it. We'll do 2 challenges remaining and we'll wrap things up. We'll chat to you soon. Welcome back to the show. Okay, let's do it. Let's dive into some challenger talk. We've put it off for too long on this show, and when I say we, I mean literally I, because I haven't seen it. I finally saw it during the course of the week. There's much to unpack about this film. Let's go in with this. What is your top line impressions? Is this a good film, or is this a good tennis film?
I think it's both. I went in with really low expectations. I don't know why. I think I didn't want to get too excited or be too disappointed. I'm a master at the emotional hedge, and I think this was one of them. But I was really struck by the entire movie. It was so it was so well structured. It was so well written. Like I got really invested in all the characters. So just talking about the movie pieces, I love the score. And I loved even how they structured the entire film and the story of these characters around a tennis match. We talk about the drama and the narrative of tennis matches. I mean, you do it regularly. And why not make it into a film? It's so cinematic, right? So I think as a film, the main 3 performers were really good. But then as a tennis film, I feel like this movie got a lot of things about tennis that a lot of people miss. And it understood tennis fundamentally in a way that Breakpoint didn't, and many other pieces of tennis media don't. So my answer is probably a 9 out of 10 film or 8 out of 10 film and a 10 out of 10 tennis film, to be honest.
Let me ask you a different question, perhaps throwing you a hand grenade here, but let's try it anyway. Has Challengers done more for the marketing of tennis as a sport than any of the tours combined have in the last 5 years?
The short answer is yes. I don't think it's for lack of trying. I think if Zendaya puts her, how famous she is right now, she puts her name, if Zendaya showed up at the WTA tour for the last 5 years, it would probably have the same effect. You put Zendaya in anything and it's gonna do more for the marketing of your sport. But in terms of effort also, I actually think so. It just got something so fundamental about how fun and kinetic and energetic and dramatic that tennis is. I always try to explain it to people of why I love it so much. And now I can just say, watch the movie, watch the tennis scenes in this movie, and then you'll get it.
So much to unpack from as I sort of transition my head and start doing some art analysis here. What was your thoughts on the score? I know this has been a major point of discussion. I know, I agree with you. I love the score. What do you think of its involvement within some of the scenes? Because I know this has been a narrative floating around there about how it basically is A, too loud, and B, just constantly inserting itself into scenes, and the sort of artistic choice to do that. I personally think it works. I think it's a really interesting use of music, especially non-diegetic music like that. But what were your thoughts on it?
I loved it. And I'm a film nerd. So I've liked Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's scores since The Social Network, where they kind of did a similar thing. If they took the score you type of expect for this type of film and turned it on its head. This is a sports film, but there's no dramatic violins at the most dramatic moment or anything like that. It's all techno and house and big beats and choral music, which is so not the vibes that I think it was such a confident choice that it just works. I do think almost at some points the score does a lot of heavy lifting for the script. I think there are moments where they just use the score and maybe I could have used a little bit more from the characters. I don't want to get into spoilers there. So I almost think it's almost too good as part of the movie in some ways.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think it is a very deliberate choice deployed by the director as well and the editor to involve the score so heavily, especially within scenes. And I think it helps elevate the material, like especially in those conversations, because those conversations I think take on the role of a tennis match, right? I think that's. I mean, I'm not. I think I'm not adding any level of nuance to this conversation, but I think it's important to say that the tennis match happens on court and it also happens off court during the course of this these sequences between these characters here, and I think it helps elevate that.
Do you come out of the movie being team Art or team Patrick, and or did you see the movie that way? And again, we can do a spoiler warning if we're going into spoilers, but can also keep it spoiler free.
That's such a difficult question. I think mostly that depends on your sort of sexuality reading of this movie as well, because clearly there are elements of the discussion of whether or not this is a queer movie or there's a movie that's. I mean, it is very literally queer coded. It has to be, right? Like there's no two ways about it. That given some of the things that happen during this movie. And I think the discussion of whether or not you end up on either of those teams, I think, is dependent upon your reader of the whole situation, which is happening as well. I don't know really how to answer that without getting too spoilery. Let's just put a spoiler warning here and say, this feels like, in some ways, that Tashi is almost the third wheel here between this, and it feels like a gay movie to me in that capacity. Like it feels like a gay romance, I should say, between Patrick and Art, and Tashi just happens to be the sort of inciting incident behind that, and it's a conduit to them finding, the sort of that the elements of that relationship coming full circle. But I guess that is just a reading of that, and I think that's what makes this such an interesting film, is that your read of that can depend upon which character you resonate more with, perhaps.
That's fair. I mean, I'm team Art and Patrick, end up as the primary duo in the movie as well. And just in that they're the only ones you ever see happy in the movie. Everyone else are always all like fighting, but you see them in their happiest. And I feel like the movie is telling us something with that. But yeah, I suppose the movie wouldn't be doing its job if there was a clear answer coming out of it of which quote unquote team that you're on.
What do you make of the narrative around the toxicity of all three of these characters in regards to, I don't think any of them are particularly nice. I think maybe you could potentially make the case that Art is the nicest of the bunch, but even then there are elements to it that are extremely toxic and extremely damaged, and someone that I don't think is particularly all there in terms of having good emotions in check. But what was your read in terms of how likable these characters are, and B, the depiction of the relationships here, and whether or not it's positive to see that on screen?
I mean, I found it a really fascinating, actually, just like reflection of like tennis in some ways, and not just because this movie was made for me in a lab and happening to be about tennis and all these other things. But, when they're at their meanest and most toxic, they're also meant to be like 19 or 20 years old, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, who is their best behaved at 18 and 19 years old? Not most people, but they're also at that point entrusted with these like big decisions, like going pro and being on tour and, making coaching decisions. And yet they're still also like emotionally 22 years old at the same time, right? Like even at the height of like at the match, I think they're all like 30 or 31, which, aging is a privilege in the grand scheme of things. It's still quite young for all like the toxic thing that they're displaying and all of that. So it had me thinking a lot actually about like how being a professional tennis player probably just really stunts you emotionally in some ways. You're surrounded by yes men. You're only interacting with these other really like high achieving, singularly focused people, for example, on a day-to-day. Like it's just got to make it almost like illuminated something for me about how we hold tennis players to all these high standards and being like great speakers about the world or like great speakers about relationships or about women. But like, of course, Stefanos Tsitsipas talks about love the way he does. He's only ever played tennis since he was 13 or 14 or 7 years old. Right. So for me, I actually found it I guess that what I'm saying is I suppose all tennis players are toxic then.
I think it's probably true. I mean, Patrick probably literally says in the movie, doesn't he, that of course I'm a baby. My job is to hold a racket and to play tennis or something along the lines. I'm bastardizing the quote, but in essence saying like he doesn't know anything else. Like this is his whole life. He didn't get taught anything other than this. So it stands to reason that he's going to act in a certain way. I just love your opinion quickly on this. I know we're not a film podcast, but goodness me, if ever there was an opportunity to do so, do you think so much is made of Zendaya being on the cover of this and her being marketed as the chief element of this film? She's kind of getting a little lost in some ways, right? She is the catalyst. She is the thing that sort of sparks everything at the same time. But really, it kind of seems like the two guys are the real. I don't want to say no. I don't mean this as like stars of the show in terms of from that perspective. I just more mean like in terms of who the film is really about. It kind of feels like their film in some ways, their story, and Zendaya's is kind of orchestrating it from the middle. Which I guess you could also make a reading that is her character as well, because she kind of enjoys that side of things and she's looking for something else after she has the injury. So I guess you could read that as well.
Yeah, I have always been a little cooler on Zendaya as an actress. Like she doesn't do it for me the way that she does for other folks, even in Dune or Dune 2. I'm like, she's good, but she's not to me and I've never watched Euphoria, so that could be my big blind spot there. But so I totally agree with you that she was outshone by the two, by Mike Feist and Josh O'Connor for me. But I wonder if that's just they just had so much better chemistry with each other. Like even though they both had chemistry with her as well, like they just had. I don't know. They had some of the best scenes, like the churro scene. Like that's maybe the most amount of chemistry in the movie, right? So I totally agree with you that like it's great for her to be the face of the movie, to get people in the theater and to see it. And like she was apparently a producer on the film, so if that meant she had a hand in how the movie turned out, then like power to her. And then I'm a big fan of Zendaya as a producer. But I totally agree with you that like, especially like older Tashi didn't really read totally right to me. So I'm with you on that, I'd say.
I mean, not just the churro scene, definitely that sauna scene as well. Talk about charged scenes as well.
Can't forget that.
Some interesting perspective in that scene as well. If we want to talk about queer code and all the things that go with it, there's many, many interesting camera shots and how it's chosen to be blocked and directed as well, which I think is really fun and really interesting. And if you haven't seen it, I think get ready for that scene. I think there's some interesting stuff happening there. Yeah. Anything else you want to touch on quickly? Man, we should do a full episode on this. Like it's such a talk about an important film in our sport. Like we probably should give it more time than we actually have done here.
I'm definitely down because I have tons of thoughts about the film in many layers, like just on the tennis piece, like just on all of it. But I'll say everyone should go see it, whether hopefully you love tennis if you're listening to the show anyway. But I would say if you're a tennis fan, don't be afraid to see it. I don't think it's going to make you upset. I think a lot of tennis fans went in a little bit skeptical, given how tennis media has been lately. But I feel like it really does a fun job of showing the world of tennis. And you'll get a toxic love story, love triangle, love throuple on top of it anyhow. So what's not to like?
Absolutely. Do you have anything you want to shout out for two challenges remaining? Whatever the grammatical correct way to build that sentence is.
Sure thing. If we're keeping on the theme of movies and TV, the latest season of Hacks was very, very good and very fun, and always just a very fun show for talking about showbiz and shows trying to show the behind the scenes of things like sports and entertainment. Highly recommend the latest season. What about you?
I mean, mine was going to be giving shout out and love, probably not love. Love is way too aggressive. Giving a shout out to Real Madrid winning their 15th Champions League or European title. Just talk about a record which is really insurmountable at this point and is inevitable. It was very, very impressive to watch a side look like complete and utter trash for 45 minutes and then somehow still end up winning in what is perhaps one of the most challenging tournaments to win in any part of sport. So I will give that a shout out against the backdrop of saying that I'm not entirely sure. Is it possible to say they didn't deserve this tournament? I guess they kind of did at the same time. I don't know. Like, let's leave it there under the assumption this is a tennis podcast and not a football one. Thank you, Brie, for joining us. Do you want to shout out anything? I don't know if you have anything that you want to shout out, but feel free to do so. Where will people find you? Do you want to do that side of things? I don't know.
Oh, sure thing. I am no longer on the X, but I do have a Substack where I actually did write about challengers called greenlight.substack.com, where you can see some takes about tennis, about movies, about film, about TV, about Coco Gauff finally winning the US Open. All that I write in sporadically, but yeah, that's where you can find some more musings like these.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening. You can find us on Patreon at OpenEra, and patreon.com/OpenEra. Deb usually does the wrap up to the show if you can't remember. Or you can find us on Twitter, twitter.com/OpenEraPod. For Dylan on the ones and twos, I can do the outro still, I promise you. And for Priyanka and for myself, we'll chat to you next week.